Unrestricted birthright citizenship is a law that grants citizenship to any person born in that territory. Recently, the U.S. is talking about rescinding that privilege. I'm Larry Fedoruk, and this is Later That Same Life. On each episode of my weekly podcast, a different topic, discussion, or story from our lives.
Season 17, Chapter 6.
Birthright Citizenship.
When I say the U.S. is talking about changing birthright citizenship, I mean, of course, the dirt disturber-in-chief, Donald Trump.
And some of the cases we're talking about would be ending birthright citizenship, which now comes to the fore. That was meant for the babies of slaves. It wasn't meant for people trying to scam the system and come into the country.
It has led to quite the discussion about this decades-old law, and in parts of the world, a centuries-old practice. So this week, let's look at birthright citizenship, how it came to be, why some people want to change it, why others are defending it. If you've been following the story, you've no doubt heard these two Latin phrases by now. Jus soli, meaning right of soil, and jus sanguinis, right of blood, which means you become a citizen by ancestry. You are a citizen of the country your parents are citizens of, regardless of where on earth you were born. There is a third way of becoming a citizen of a country, and that's called naturalization. That is a process allowed by most free nations, including the U.S. and Canada. It often involves a number of criteria: residency under some legal status, knowledge of language, history, obey the law, etc. And even then you have to apply and eventually take a test. And if you pass, you swear an oath. That's a lot. No such hassles for us jus solis. Legal residency can come under a lot of different headings: landed immigrant status, refugees, asylum seekers, migrant workers, other work visas, education visas. Then there's just visitors. And visitors, at least when it comes to Canada, U.S., or U.S.-Canada, are generally limited to just under half a year, i.e. 182 days in a single calendar year. Any longer than that, and you have to apply for one of the statuses previously mentioned. Statuses? Stati? Well, back to citizenship, and of course birthright citizenship, jus soli. In an unrestricted form, the U.S. has it. So does Canada. A good part of Latin and South America also. But after that, not too many other places. Around 33 countries have unrestricted birthright citizenship. And interesting that most of them are in the New World. Across the pond, where a lot of the modern civilizations began, they are a bit more restrictive. Most European countries, for example, if you are born in that country, you do not automatically become a citizen of that country. At least one of your parents also has to be a citizen, and they have had to have lived in the country for 8 years. That's a very common rule across many European countries. In France, for example, if neither parent fills the criteria as a French citizen, well, you're not a citizen just because you were born there, but depending on your eventual residency, you are allowed to apply early in the citizenship process. Some of the rules get really complicated. For example, jus sanguinis, the right of blood, well, it can mean not just your parents. Some countries like Ireland, Italy, Hungary, others, allow citizenship to be passed down several generations. Many countries allow dual, triple, or even multiple citizenships. So you have an Irish father, an Italian mother, a Hungarian grandparent. You were born in the USA, but you're naturalized in Canada. Well, the possibilities are almost endless. You can also become an honorary citizen of a country. Many nations bestow these, usually upon an individual who's made some significant cultural or humanitarian contribution to the hoi polloi. It's honorary. You don't get a passport or the right to vote. On the other hand, you don't have to file a tax return either. I believe in Canada, the honorary citizenship comes with a $25 Tim's card. You can also renounce a citizenship. U.S. Senator from Texas, Ted Cruz, born in Calgary to an American mother and a Cuban exile, renounced his jus soli Canadian citizenship over 10 years ago. And gosh, we miss him dearly. Tina Turner renounced her American citizenship years ago. I believe that was basically for tax purposes. Renounce. Such a strong word, huh? Like you're shedding some defamatory cloak of shame and throwing it onto a witch's fire. It's unwanted. I hereby renounce you. I guess some people do renounce. Others, well, they just kind of give it up. They announce more than renounce. They just kind of let it expire. Hey, maybe we should have to renew our citizenship every few years, regardless of where we were born. You know what they always ask? Could a natural-born citizen of a country even pass the new citizenship test for their own country? British North America Act, 1867, Hudson's Bay, Beaver, Maple Leaf, Rockies, Cabot Trail, and none of it. Did I make it? Point is, citizenship. You can have it thrust upon you, you can achieve it, and then you can also get rid of it. People say that jus soli and birthright citizenship are exactly the same thing. Well, not quite. Jus soli, the right of the soil, comes from Old English common law. But in the day, it wasn't so much a right as a classification of subjugation. When you were born in a certain county, that meant you came under the jurisdiction of the lord or baron of that land, subject to the laws and taxes. It still means that, pretty much. But it wasn't so much that you had a right to be a citizen. It meant more that you were under obligation to be that citizen. I don't want to be from Sussex. I want to be from Kent. Shut your gob. Heralded as one of the first People's Bill of Rights was the Magna Carta, issued in 1215. That was a very good year. It addressed the rights of free men within the realm, but it never really addressed how someone was to be considered as part of the realm. Those discussions came much later. But eventually, jus soli was instituted into the English common law. Interestingly, the UK does not go by jus soli today. They go by a combination of the right of soil and the right of blood. Jus sanguinis, that is more closely associated with the French Civil Code of 1804. Canada has jus soli. If you're born here, that's automatic citizenship. We didn't always have it. We did practice it generally because we were colonized largely by England. They had it, so we did it too. Canada officially adopted jus soli into law in 1947. And ironically, as I mentioned, England, the UK, has since dropped it. In 1983, they now use a version of that common European model I mentioned earlier. Birthright citizenship became law in the United States in July of 1868. It was a late addition to the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. 3 years before that, the 13th Amendment ended slavery in the USA. The 14th Amendment actually covers a lot of different things. But here's the opening line of Article 1. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state where they reside. End of quote. That line in that article was seen as a pathway for slaves, predominantly Africans, to become African Americans. Previous to that, birthright citizenship was kind of assumed in the U.S., but then came along something known as the Dred Scott decision. And this will be a very brief synopsis. It's worth your while to find longer versions for this story on YouTube. The man known as Dred Scott was U.S. born into slavery. As the U.S. became divided into free states and slave states, Dred Scott claimed his freedom. His case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. They ruled against him and further said that African slaves were never and could never be citizens, and that the U.S. government had no rights under the Constitution to demand such a thing. The Dred Scott decision, considered to be one of the worst decisions the United States Supreme Court ever made. So now we're back to this 14th Amendment. What lawmakers said was, hey, if the Supreme Court says we don't have the law, well, let's create the law. Here the law says clearly, anyone born in the U.S. is a citizen. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state where they reside. So in their way, anyone who says that birthright citizenship was a way to help enslaved peoples is technically correct, but really that's not the whole story.
Birthright citizenship, which now comes to the fore, that was meant for the babies of slaves.
Even as enslaved Africans were granted citizenship in 1868, did you know that the indigenous peoples in the U.S., the so-called Native Americans, in the day called Indians, were not citizens under U.S. law? They didn't get that right until 1924. So what is happening now? Essentially, the U.S. has three branches of government: the executive, legislative, and judicial. Executive, that's the president, the vice president, and the cabinet members. You know, all the secretaries of the various departments. Legislative, well, that is the elected members of the Senate and the Congress. Judicial, well, that is the court systems, including, at the top, the Supreme Court. Through an executive order, which the president has the power to issue, Trump wrote basically an amendment to unrestricted birthright citizenship in the U.S. As the three branches of government are set up to be a system of checks and balances, legislators, mostly those against Trump, said the president cannot make these changes through executive order, so they asked judicial, in this case a federal judge, to issue an injunction so Trump's change to birthright citizenship could not be put into practice. That happened, and it got appealed. Through the appeal process, it ended up on the desks of the Supreme Court justices. The Supreme Court ruled neither in favor of Trump or in favor of the injunctions. What they did say, that those federal judges cannot block a law that affects all Americans. One federal judge can perhaps rule on a single case or for a single jurisdiction, but in order to overturn, in this case, a Trump executive order, several judges must rule on many individual cases, and or class action lawsuits must come forward. Again, so that not just one judge can make a ruling that affects everybody.
I was elected on a historic mandate, but in recent months we've seen a handful of radical left judges effectively try to overrule the rightful powers of the president to stop the American people from getting the policies that they voted for in record numbers. It was a grave threat to democracy, frankly, and instead of merely ruling on the immediate cases before them, these judges have attempted to dictate the law for the entire nation.
This practice of turning to one federal judge to issue an injunction against a presidential decision, it's not new to the second Trump term. It really goes back to Obama's first term and was used a lot also through Trump 45 and Biden as well. It is a problem. So what the Supreme Court basically said was that this is not what the system was meant to do. It wasn't meant to be a political weapon to issue injunctions. The whole thing was getting out of hand. So when it comes to this birthright citizenship, the Supreme Court ruling may seem to some more like a Trump victory. But even then, most legal experts agree. The president alone has no power on his own to change the citizenship rules of the U.S. In other words, to go against the Constitution. The president actually swears to protect and uphold the Constitution. Who can actually change the law, amend the Constitution? Well, the legislative branch. Now, they can be influenced by the president in many ways, not all of them of high moral ground, but they can also be influenced by the American voters. Of course, the Americans voted for Trump, who campaigned largely on shutting down the borders, deporting the illegals, and basically telling Americans that immigrants are bad. Trump's narrative that bad people are sneaking into the country to do bad things, according to him, should not be rewarded if their children, by some luck, are born here. This reward being citizenship for their offspring. In his first term, Trump even attempted to end DACA, which was an Obama initiative. DACA. the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, sometimes called the DREAM Act, and the offspring involved are often called the Dreamers. DACA basically said the children of illegal immigrants brought to the U.S. as kids should not be punished for the actions of their parents and should instead be offered a pathway to citizenship. Yeah, Trump tried to end that one too. The Supreme Court ruled against him. Birthright citizenship. Who's defending it? Well, generally, immigration worldwide increases year to year. More people are on the move, and for a number of reasons. In 2023, 1 out of every 7 Americans was an immigrant. In Canada, it's about 1 in 4. The majority in both countries are here legally. What I'm saying is that more and more people are moving to live and work and raise a family. And a birthright citizenship is considered a good way to help integrate immigrants into a population. There is no evidence that illegal or undocumented immigrants come to the U.S. in large numbers just to give birth. But let me add to that we really don't make laws for the majority. We make laws to give the majority some recourse against the very few who break the law. Very few people rob banks, but we have a law against it, and the rest of us are generally pretty good with that. Also, nationality is not a freedom. You can't just pick and choose, per se. Oh, I know eventually you can move somewhere and get status and then go through the process. But your nationality will always be a combination of soil and blood. You don't get to choose that. So when it comes to the jus soli and the jus sanguinis, perhaps the government should not be wielding those two as a power to grant or take away, like, say, Hitler did. Birthright citizenship is a way to automatically give a human being status, the rights and protections offered to the citizens of a country, understanding that those rights come with responsibilities. These are some of the reasons people argue for it, for jus soli. I don't see a big problem with nations putting some restrictions on jus soli combined with jus sanguinis. So you're born here, that may get you a leg up, but other rules may apply. It's just a little harder to accept the restrictions in Canada and the U.S. because we're two nations built on immigration. And some say rescinding the birthright citizenship means you're using babies as a bargaining chip. And then the other side says, yeah, but they already are. You know, in any country, no matter how much of a mosaic or a melting pot or how tolerant we are, citizenship adds a tier. Those without it are considered second class. Maybe not cruelly so, but nevertheless. A lot of immigrants will say, you know, I had to put up with a lot when I moved here, but at least my son and daughter are born here. A lot of the backlash on Trump's executive order stems from the fact that it's Donald Trump. If he says it, I must be against it. It must be crazy. I get that, because he says and does a lot of crazy shit. And others say, well, if we start amending jus soli, where do we draw the line? Well, you know how I feel about that argument. Drawing the lines is what society does. Where to draw the lines is the constant discussion. That's the democracy, the evolution of the society. Lines move. It was there, now it's here, one day it could be there. The bigger problem? Trump is trying to push through all of these things on his own. He's the executive. He has stacked the judicial with his supporters, and he threatens the legislative with being primaried. This is the term. Support me, or you won't get reelected. You won't even get the nomination in the primary to get reelected. I'll throw my money behind someone who supports me. 3 levels of government under the control of one person. Gone are the checks and balances. That was never the intent. So that's the real threat to America. It's not birthright citizenship. It's Trump-right citizenship.
Later That Same Life is written, voiced, and produced by Larry Fedoruk. LarryFedoruk37@gmail.com. Subscribe to Larry's podcast YouTube channel. Get automatic notifications with each new episode.